to the Keeping It Together podcast with me, Rachel Broughton, and I am joined today by a very special guest, Anne Hutchinson. Anne is a long-time family friend of mine, and so it's a privilege to have her on, but she has a particular specialism. She has been the head teacher of a specialist school in Devon for 16 years now, with a particular specialism in autism. She has her master's in childhood autism, and we are going to have a chat to her today about neurodiversity, spirituality, and the church experience of people with neurodiversity. So welcome to the podcast, Anne.
Thank you.
It's a real privilege to have you on. Is there anything else that you want to say about yourself, or have I covered everything?
Oh, I think you've covered it really, the main thing, yeah.
Yeah, great. You've got 2 kids of your own, haven't you?
Yeah, 2 grown-up children and 2 grandchildren, so yeah.
Plenty of experience of family life and all
Yeah.
of that. So great. And tell me about your Christian life. So how long have you been a Christian for? Are you in a church locally to you?
Yeah, so I've been a Christian since I was very young. I was fortunate to be brought up in a Christian family. So, I made a commitment, myself many years ago. And I go to a church locally here in Devon, just a small local church. So
Brilliant.
I've been in quite a few different denominations of churches over the years, Church of England and Pentecostal churches and Assemblies of God and Baptist churches. So I'm in a small non-denominational church at the moment.
Fabulous, thank you. And I want to get into what we're going to talk about, because we hear so much terminology and it's almost familiar to us, but many of us don't really know what it truly means. So I want to just ask you very basically, what is neurodiversity, and also what's this word spectrum that we hear associated with it? What do those things mean?
Well, neurodiversity is that the brain is working, in a very diverse way, that we don't all of our brains don't necessarily work in exactly the same way. They have, a diverse way of working. So it's as simple as that, really. I think we've lost connection.
Oh, we have. There we go. Hang on, we're back. We're back. Fab.
We're back. Yeah.
So, yeah, neurodiversity is
the fact that our brains all work very differently, and some people's brains work more differently than others. And when we talk about a spectrum, it means, it is a whole range of differences. That would be typical of all of us.
Yeah, okay, great.
It's a simple way of understanding it.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me about, within your specialism, what sort of things are you seeing, and what does that mean in your context?
So I run a school for children with autistic spectrum disorders, and a range of other communication interaction needs. Mostly that means that those children have an autism diagnosis of some sort. We also have lots of children there that have gone through a significant amount of trauma, which presents very differently. It means some children have been sometimes misdiagnosed with an autism diagnosis, and actually their presentation is often due to some of the traumas that they've experienced as well. So, and then we have children with other comorbid conditions such as ADHD, and children with significant mental health needs as well, lots of anxiety, which often goes hand in hand with autism too.
Yes, okay, so people experiencing autism also are vulnerable to experiencing poor mental health, or anxiety, depression, low mood, stress, those kinds of things. So families who have children who have autism or ADHD are also having to navigate that as well, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. That they're often, I find that our young people are often misunderstood. That in itself, for any of us, leads to, when we're misunderstood, it creates anxiety. And yeah, that a lot of our families are navigating really tricky circumstances in terms of children's mental health as well.
Yeah. So, how would a person get a diagnosis of autism or ADHD? What would that look like? And is that different if you're a child and if you're an adult? Because I know that a lot of adults possibly get diagnosed later in life. So, what does the diagnosis process look like?
Well, it varies for different people, depending on your age and kind of how how people have got curious about that. So often for the families that I work with, their children at quite a young age have presented. They've started to get a bit curious about, some of the differences in the way that they're presenting or developing. Sometimes it's picked up by health visitors or, other professionals. Quite often it happens when a child's at sort of nursery age, and then perhaps childminders, nursery staff are starting to be curious along with the families as to kind of there's something different's happening here. We're not sure what's going on. And they would make a referral through their GP usually to go for assessments. And it works differently in different authorities in terms of how that assessment process is carried out. And in terms of later in life, what we find is that quite often some of the families that I work with, the parents themselves, when their child is going through an assessment, they become curious about their own needs and the way their own brain works. And they're quite often saying, oh, gosh, that's me, actually. I do that. Or, they see things with a different lens, and it makes sense to them of some of their own struggles or just their own unique ways. So quite often some of the adults will get a late life diagnosis, or not even necessarily an official diagnosis, but they'll start reading around, a diagnosis like autism or ADHD, and just want to gain more understanding themselves. And often in understanding their child, they understand themselves more as well. So that can sort of bring with it sometimes a sense of real grief, I find, for the parents, where they realise, gosh, I struggled all the way through school, or, I'm now 38, 40 something, and only just beginning to make sense of my own self. And I mean, that can be true of any of us at any stage in life as we evolve and learn more about ourselves and understand more about ourselves. But it can be particularly sad for just adults, as we realise, gosh, all those years where I didn't understand or I was misunderstood, and now this makes sense. And then, they don't want that to be their own child's experience, and, they wrestle to ensure that is better for their own child. Yeah.
One of my best friends has recently been diagnosed with autism as an adult, and it's been really fascinating for her. It's really helped her to understand herself, and it's been really beneficial for her marriage as well.
Yeah.
Because I think when your brain does work differently, when you have some neurodiversity there, whatever that looks like, whether it is autism, whether it is ADHD, or whether trauma's affected your brain in such a way that the brain is operating it differently, it does affect your relationships, and it affects how you communicate, and all of those kinds of things. So how do you see families kind of engaging with some of that grief, like you were talking about, and even as a Christian, some of those questions around, like, why is this happening, and where's God in this process? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to answer the why if we get fixed on the why. The only way that I've been able to align it in my own brain is that we live in a broken, fallen world, that, this was never God's plan for it to be like that, and I just literally, for my own self, I have to draw a line there and think, okay, this is, there's so much research still to be done around, the causes of, different diagnosis and, lots of different debates and thoughts on that there is no definitive on those things either yet. So I imagine, maybe one day we'll know where this has all come from and, the cause and things and then how genetically that's been passed through as well. So I just kind of have to draw a line under that and think, okay, we're in a broken, fallen world. And yet try and take my eyes off the why and think of the how. Okay, how is God going to be glorified in this? That's often a question I'm asking. Okay, God, this is a mess. For some families, the situations they're living in, it's really, really messy. Supporting a child with really extreme needs sometimes. And it's just that how are you going to be glorified, God? And as, a Christian, how can I, as part of the body of Christ, support others and love them well, whether it's the person with the diagnosis or the family. Often it's the families that really need the support because, they're the ones that are having to hold so much. Just asking God, how are you going to be glorified? Help me see you in this, and what's my part, as a part of this church congregation, or as a neighbour, how do you want me to be in this,
Yeah, and the church historically, some denominations at least, haven't always been very accepting of this idea of neurodiversity. And I mean, we've talked about it on the podcast before about mental health generally. Some denominations have rejected the idea of needing medication, of needing more support and therapy. Some denominations still don't advise congregants to get therapy or to take medication. And even recently we've had politicians internationally claiming things about autism, saying it's caused by this, that or the other. And I just wonder if what you can say to that, really, just as an encouragement to us, but also maybe debunking some of that stuff.
Yeah, so the causes, there is, the jury's still out. There's so much research still to be done. So I don't know how people can claim some of the things they're claiming at the moment. In terms of medication, I guess those people that you're saying, they would say no to medication. Maybe they say no to all medication for any condition. I don't know. But I just think it's, as a parent, you want to seek God for yourself and ask him for wisdom. The Bible says that he will give us wisdom if we ask for it. And there will be some medical professionals who would really be pushing the medication, and others where it would be virtually impossible to get medication that's really desperately needed. So it's not a straightforward thing, even if you'd made the decision as a parent that, right, I really think my child, we want to access medication. It's often quite difficult. It's not as easy as people would think, because understandably the psychiatrists that would be, prescribing it, are very cautious. And I've seen, for children that I work with, some really great results with medication in terms of really helping them in terms of anxiety and obsessive compulsive conditions. And for others, no difference. So, it's very much dependent on the individual and how they respond to particular medications. And I don't think there can be a one size fits all. And, doctors don't think there is either. Some medication works brilliantly for some, but it just doesn't work for somebody else. So I think it's a last resort thing. It's not something that families get to in their heads very easily either. So yeah, just as a Christian, I would be asking God for wisdom, show me, just like for other areas of life, because it is a big deal. We don't always know the outcomes of medication and things. So
and the reality is that these things are not things that can just be fixed by taking a pill.
No.
The reality is some bouts of depression are seasonal or are circumstantial, and they kind of come and go. But this isn't something like depression. This is the way that your brain is neurologically wired. It's not something that is going to just go away. This is the way that a person is, and the way that a person is built, and the way that a person thinks, and the way that their whole body it responds to anything and everything.
And often we need to have changed other things first, So I would always encourage families to really explore, have other things been, really tried first? Has the environment been adapted? Have we really understood our child's needs? So, or, in the church setup, are we really enabling this child, or are we making things more difficult? And quite often it's our own, it's the others, it's other people's responses that are making something very difficult for a child or young person. We need to kind of start with those things, and when all of those things are in place and things are still very difficult, then it would make sense to have a look at medication as an absolute sort of last resort.
Well, talking about environment, I was going to ask you about engagement with something like church. Because from my experience, families who are navigating neurodiversity within the family, whether it be a parent or a child or a grown-up child, what are some of the barriers to families experiencing those challenges to actually accessing that community that could be such a support for them, but because maybe we're not aware, or because we've got a rigid framework that we fit to, what are some of the barriers to those families accessing church?
I think quite often families are afraid of the response that they're going to get, not the welcome at the door, that's nearly always great, but it's the actual how that pans out during a church service, so particularly if their child is, like a lot of the children I work with are very often very noisy. A lot of the children are pre-verbal, so they're not communicating with words, and that can mean they're communicating in other ways which can be quite noisy, or their bodies can be very mobile, and so I think for a lot of families it is just difficult, that whole just how am I going to contain, that sense we've got to contain our child in this relatively formal situation, where people are loud 1 minute singing and then they're very quiet, or now we're praying, or now that person's speaking. That is a really hard scenario to go into for any family with a child with autism, for example, or any neurodiversity. So I think just the nature of what a church service often looks like is quite challenging. The busyness, often very busy, can be quite loud, can be very unpredictable in some ways really predictable, but other ways unpredictable. Different people from the front might be more accepting than others. So those things create quite a lot of anxiety for families. If there's no space to go out too easily with your child, or it's difficult to navigate to the toilets, for example, just practical things that make it a bit of a minefield, literally.
And there's lots of triggers, lots of people. It's a crowded space, and lots of different sounds, different noises, and like you were talking
it's a real sensory sort of a huge sensory overwhelm can occur for some children going into that, and equally, if they do it regularly, they can become used to those things, and some children, they can manage that really well, so it's not that, we'd say to people, don't do it, it's too overwhelming. It's just finding ways to make it better for the child.
And what are some of those things that we could do? I was just thinking as you were talking then, thinking, okay, if as a church leader, if I'm aware of a family in church who are navigating that, what are some of the tools that you use in a school setting that could easily translate over into a church setting that we could use? I don't know, as you were speaking, I was thinking about often our church services are quite rhythmic. We know what's kind of coming, but maybe the family or the young person doesn't. sometimes in schools you have boards that kind of have visuals. We're going to sing, and then
Yeah,
we're going to pray, and then we're going to take communion, and then you can go out to
yeah.
kids' church. Something visual that helps them. Are there some other things that we could do as churches to just support and include those families that might find it overwhelming?
Yeah, I mean, those sort of practical things like visuals would be really helpful. I guess it's quite difficult because in some churches the service is and is it is laid out and it's predictable, and in others it kind of evolves as you go depending on the type of church you're in. So if you'd got visuals that were laid out and then it suddenly changed, that
Wasn't.
would be a challenge for some families.
Gosh.
So um but I think any sort of visual support like that, and it's quite often it would be, yeah, Velcro pictures and a strip that a family could then create themselves with somebody who knew what was going to be happening, and you'd want to not make it too specific, so you had a bit of flexibility there. So it might be that we're singing and then we're listening and then we're going out to the kids club or something. And I think many families, if they're supported well at school, would be able to adapt systems that the school uses, such as we use wait buttons. So if we need a child to wait for the next thing, there might be like 5 Velcro dots and we call them wait buttons. It's 5 waits and then it's kids club. So as a parent, or as a somebody who is supporting that child, you could be saying, oh, it's 5 waits and then it's kids club. So it's kind of like a countdown, and they can visually see you take those buttons off the Velcro strip. Or if the child really loves I don't know, dogs, you'd have 5 dog pictures, it's 5 weights, and you just take the dog off, or something that the child would be interested by. And it might be that they got a fascination with Pokemon, it'd be 5 Pokemons and you take them off. And just as a way of helping them, it's something for them to focus on when they're starting to get dysregulated, and then out they can go out then to the kids club or to the
Yeah.
thing that might be more regulating for them. But I think one of the things that we talk about a lot in our work is the work of Dan Siegel. He's a clinical psychiatrist, and his work is all around interpersonal neurobiology. So the way that we respond to each other is so critical in terms of that interpersonal stuff and the impact that has on our brains. And he talks about the 4 S's, and so they're safe, seen, soothed, and secure.
So safe,
And
seen, soothed.
being soothed and secure, and that we all need that, but particularly children, young people with neurodiversity. So, and we apply those in school, but I think they can be applied really well in the church context. So the idea is that we need to all feel safe. So when children are coming into church, families are coming into church, they need to feel protected, emotionally, that people are there for them. They need things to be predictable, and they need leaders to be able to repair scenarios with them as well if there's problems, so that ultimately leads to that sense of safety. They need to be seen, so they need to know that somebody's attuning to their needs. So if you've got a mum or a dad there struggling with a child at the side, or in the service, you want somebody, with body ministry, to be responding so that parent isn't struggling on their own. So they're just seen, and that attunement rather than judgment, just that kind of understanding that something's happened or something's happening for this child right now. And what do you need? It might be that you're the mum at the side, kind of trying to hold on to your child so they're not running out of the building. And it might just be that if somebody went and got them a drink of squash, that might really help. So it's that just letting the parent know that I've seen you. What can I do? In the moment, not after the end of the service and say, oh yes, I saw it was difficult. Just
Yeah.
getting up and going. So that's safe and seen and soothed. So we want to help each other regulate. Ultimately, good self-regulation comes from the fact that we've all been co-regulated really well, so, and often these children in these tricky moments, they're just really dysregulated and they need somebody to co-regulate with them. And their parent might be struggling to co-regulate because they're dysregulated themselves, because they're thinking, yet again, I knew I shouldn't have come, I can't manage it here, and listen to the noise, and so for somebody in the congregation or a leader to be able to go over and just lend them their calm and just be, I'm here, we're with you, it's okay, can we do anything? We could go over here if you want. But that parent and child not feeling judged that we're the problem, we've got to get out, but actually we can find a way to make this work. So they're soothed, and that would help their nervous system to regulate better. And then if you've got safe, seen and soothed all in place, ultimately as humans we feel secure, and that would lead to us believing, okay, this is a trustworthy place, this is a safe place, this is a place where leaders are reliable, they're teaching about God is loving and he's ever present and with me, and he's a comforter, so I think that kind of, when I was thinking about it this morning, I thought that's a helpful model, whether we're in school or in church, so
That's
yeah,
really
the
helpful.
forest.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's some really practical things that that definitely I can take back to my church setting, just from you sharing that. As I was thinking a little bit about this conversation, I was really drawn to 1 Corinthians 12, verse 12 onwards, where it's talking about, I think you alluded to it earlier as well, that one body with many parts section that Paul's
Yeah,
writing about. The human body has many parts, but the many parts make up one body. So it is with the body of Christ. And it kind of goes on to say, if the foot says, I'm not a part of the body because I'm not a hand, I think sometimes people who are navigating neurodiversity within their family think, but we don't look like that family. But we don't
yeah,
operate in a way that runs as smoothly as that. And it's sort of, they can be made to feel, or they do feel, a sense of, well, I'm not a hand, so I
yeah,
can't exist here, or I can't add value to this church family. And I feel like Paul's speaking directly into those situations and saying, no, you're supposed to be here, and we
yeah,
need you here. And I think that's good. And then he does talk about in verse 22, he says, in fact, some parts of the body that seem weakest and least important are actually the most necessary. And I love
yeah,
that idea. The parts we regard as less honourable are those we clothe with the greatest care. So we carefully protect those parts that shouldn't be seen, while the most honourable parts do not require the special care. I did this idea that actually when you're vulnerable, you require the most special care and you're the most important. And I think there's much more
yeah,
to learn in how we engage with the weakest, the most vulnerable in our church families. There's more for us
yeah,
to be discipled in. There's much more for God to grow in us as we engage there than maybe we've
yeah,
given it credit for in the past. And
yeah,
sort of that idea that it's in our weakness that Christ is glorified. And if we
yeah,
can't
absolutely.
engage with those struggling and navigating neurodiversity, and we can't celebrate some of the joy that it brings,
Yeah,
and some of the hope that we find in God through looking at how the brain's working and the diverse ways that our brain functions, um, there's going to be
yeah,
some gifts in
absolutely.
church.
I think we just experienced that even just in our little life group this week ourselves actually. So one of the mums has got a son, well, she's got three children actually, and two of them with really significant neurodivergent needs, and one of them hasn't been out of his room for 4 weeks now. He's an older teenager, and real big struggles going on. And we just prayed as a live group together. We stopped what we were doing, we stood together and we prayed together and committed together that we're all going to really pray. And she messaged us in the week, just a really good news story that he'd actually come out of his room and he'd gone to college, which was massive.
That's huge.
And it would have been really easy to sort of just listen to that, because she wasn't making a big thing of it, because this is her life. She's so used to it. And when you actually dig in, it's so extreme, the things that people are going through, but it becomes their norm, and they're so used to walking that alone and people letting them down that they get very isolated and they just carry a huge weight on their own. But God answered that prayer this week. And one of the things that we talk about a lot as a church is that John 13, a new commandment I give to you, to love one another as I've loved you. And by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples. It's how we love one another. Actually, how do we love children with neurodiversity when they're screaming in our service? How are we supporting that family? That's how the world will know that we are
his disciples.
His disciples. And just link with what you're saying in Corinthians there, I was thinking about in Matthew 25, where it talks about whatever you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. And I was struck that, by the least of these, like you're saying, the most vulnerable. And he is talking to the church there, brothers and sisters. So it is something we need to focus on more as a church. It's, yes, love everyone, but particularly in the church, how are we doing that? And it is part of our growth, and it's what God's doing in us then too.
Yeah, absolutely. What an incredible encouragement, and also a really profound challenge, I think, for us to really reflect on how we are including and supporting people and families who are embracing or who are facing those challenges themselves. And thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. Really value this conversation. I know so many people will really benefit from what you've had to say, so thank you ever so much for your time.
You're welcome.